I'm your host this week, Justine Abson. This is the podcast where we tackle some of the trending topics, ideas and best practice across health and social care. In today's episode, we're joined by Louie Werth, Director of Care Research, to discuss the latest changes in CQC regulations, how care providers can adapt, and how technology can support professionals improve their regulatory ratings. So Louie, you are our only person that I think we have had, or our first person, shall I say, that we've had as a second external guest on the podcast.
I'm very honoured. I mean, another way of putting that is that I'm the best guest you've ever had. And therefore you've come and asked me back, which...
Obviously.
I'm sure that's what you meant to say.
That's what, best guest we've ever had.
It's lovely to be back. It's lovely to be back. Thank you for having me.
But yeah, it is lovely to welcome you back. And the first time you came and were a guest, it was live in the studio as well. And the second time as well. So.
Any opportunities to have a little bit of an adventure.
Yes.
I'll take it.
Well, welcome back. So the first podcast that we discussed was around CQC and things like that. But I think it was back in September, or if not, longer than that.
Probably 23.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So a lot has changed.
The gift that keeps on giving, CQC, yeah.
So we're going to dive straight into, obviously, the CQC landscape's changing. What are the most significant updates providers need to be aware of that are taking place?
I think a few really key points to bear in mind. Firstly, they have, as of, I believe it was the 4th of December 2024, they have got rid of evidence category scoring. So what CQC were doing is every single evidence category within every quality statement was scored individually. Now you do the maths, you've got 34 quality statements, between 3 or 4, sometimes even all 5 evidence categories. It becomes a huge amount of data for CQC to mark. And what CQC basically said is that this is what was slowing reports down. It's true. If you look, just a few days ago, there was a big set of reports that were published. Many of those reports were actually kind of started on, the inspection was 5-6 months ago. And that's because of all of that evidence category scoring. One of the critiques of this change, moving away from evidence category scoring, is it means that services don't have as much oversight of how they got their result. But I think and it's a big if this speeds up the process of getting reports published and assessments completed, then it will be a fair decision. So I think that's one of the big ones, the fact that they're not scoring at individual evidence category level. They're still looking at each of them, people's experiences, feedback from staff and leaders, feedback from partners, processes, observations. They're still looking at all of that, but they're not giving it a 1 to 4 for each one. They're instead using that good old CQC phrase, professional judgment, which is a nice way of saying the CQC inspector will have a think. So that's one of the big shifts. We're moving away from the evidence category scoring. The other thing we're seeing is they're redoing the reports. Okay. So if you look at the old reports, again, they're writing about each of these evidence categories. If you have a paragraph or even half a paragraph about each of them, you've got quite literally hundreds of paragraphs. And again, it's a very easy way to slow inspectors down, is to make them write pages and pages and pages. So CQC's new reports, much slimmer, sometimes as short as a sentence or two about your quality, and then perhaps a brief description of 1 or 2 more sentences. What this is going to mean, hopefully, or intended to provide, is that services will get inspected and will get their reports much quicker, which means that inspectors can move on to the next service. So it's all about speeding up. CQC aren't really binning the framework. The actual structure of the framework, the evidence categories, the quality statements, the scoring, that's all staying. What CQC are doing in 2025 is going, how do we make this work in practice? How do we increase the number of inspections? How do we ensure that everyone gets inspected regularly and that inspectors can get through and get those reports out kind of nice and quick?
And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? It's about it working in practice. It's not necessarily that, everything that was sort of implemented was not right, but it's about working it in practice. Yeah. And also, the quicker we can get reports out there that, care groups can understand where they need to learn and improve, then the quicker they can make those improvements and then obviously increase that quality of care as well.
Certainly. Well, I think a really interesting thing you mentioned there about services, making improvements and so on. I think one of the things CQC are starting to think about within themselves is, who are we for? If you compare them to, say, the NMC or to other regulatory bodies, they are clearly for the public. And I think one of the things CQC have done over the years is their reports have been so detailed that the care sector has thought of CQC as for them, where actually what CQC are for is for the public. My father's 77-year-old. There we go. My father is 77 years old. There we go. If I was to make a choice about where to, if you needed elderly care in any form, which service to use, at the moment, CQC is where I go to. Now, if I'm looking at reports that are 6 years old and are, still, even with the new framework, 15 pages long, that's too much. So I think what CQC are thinking through is perhaps we need to be briefer, to the point, so that the public can really use what we're producing. That does mean that services maybe don't get as much detail as they used to have, but I think that's part of CQC thinking through who are we here predominantly for. And I think we're starting to recognise that CQC's purpose is to make sure the public has confidence and can make decisions about care, rather than them being a support team, a troubleshooting team for the sector itself. So I think there's an interesting shift happening as CQC kind of reconciles what their purpose is. And that's affecting the fact that reports are getting shorter and so forth as well.
That's a really interesting shift as well, I think, because, you do forget that actually that is where the public can go to have a look for, everybody wants their loved ones in, a home with a great reputation, they're going to get cared for properly. And that is the route to try and find that information out. So you're right, if that information is years old.
Yeah. I mean, they are a regulatory body, not a care quality body. They are the Care Quality Commission, but what that means is that they regulate the quality of care. They don't advise. They can offer advice, individually, but they're not necessarily set up to lead the sector in care quality. They're there to regulate the sector. And I think CQC have kind of recognised we've been giving so much information in these reports and in our evidence category scoring and so on and so forth. And that is great for providers, but it doesn't necessarily hugely benefit the public. And the flip side of it is it's slowing us down. And I think what CQC are doing is thinking, how can we make sure that we are providing good quality regulation, good quality information to the public in a way that enables us to do more inspections? We did a little bit of work where we looked at 6 months of reports, and we did the maths on the 6 months of reports. If CQC were to assess all care homes at that current rate, it would take 8.5 years. And if they were going to look at all domiciliary services at the current publication rate, it was going to take over 20 years. Now, obviously, we know CQC aren't going to do that. We're not saying that that is a fact or that that's going to work out in that way, but it's a sign that they recognise that if they didn't increase the volume and increase the speed at which assessments reports happened, they were never going to be able to effectively support all services. And we know of services that are 7-8 years overdue. That isn't on. That isn't. Look at something like elderly care. The nature of elderly care is that 8 years on, the people in that service, many of them, if not all of them, are no longer there. Often because of the turnover of staff, you've got a whole new team. So really, a care home that's been inspected 8 years ago, the only thing that's the same is the building. Most of the individuals within that service, many of the staff and possibly many of the managers have changed several times in that 8 years. So I think they've recognised that frequency is key here, and how can we make this framework that does have some great content, does have some great setup, how can we make that work in a swifter way so that we can really support all services and assess them all, at a fair pace?
So what do you think are now, I guess, and they may be the same as what they've always been, but what are maybe some of the common pitfalls that providers are facing when adapting to some of the changes, and how do you think they can avoid them or really understand where they need to?
I think there's 3 pitfalls. The first one that I see most commonly is not getting to grips with the place of care staff. So in the old framework, you picked your favourite care staff and told them to come in. You phoned some other care staff, said, hey, we'll still pay you, just take the day off for the next few days. And CQC wouldn't have to bump into them. Now, care staff are very much in this situation with us. And I think for a lot of managers, they haven't really clocked that, CQC really do want to speak to everyone in the service. I spoke to a manager yesterday who said, actually, at the inspection, I pretty much just opened the door. And that really was all as the manager I did. Whereas under the old framework, I'd be sitting there in the office, showing them all the documents, giving them some Krispy Kreme donuts to make them happy. Like, I was kind of leading the situation. I think a lot of services haven't quite understood how important it is for their care staff to be supported to have those conversations. It's a big ask. It is a bit weird if you've worked in care, even if you've worked in care for a long time, it is a bit weird to be talking to a complete stranger about all of these things if that's not something you're used to. It's using a whole skill set that a lot of care staff just haven't had to exercise, those kind of professional conversations. So I think supporting staff to have those conversations with CQC is a really big one. Again, it's my favourite topic, of course, is feedback. I think that is something that's really consistently been shown. Now, I was ranting and raving about it a year and a bit ago, saying, feedback, you've got these feedback evidence categories, kind of like a prophet going, the end is nigh. And I think people thought, oh yeah, of course you're going to say that. You run a feedback research company. But we have seen services say that CQC just want to speak to our staff, our relatives, our families. It is absolutely central. They're looking at the scoring and going, my goodness, that piece has totally trumped the observation. The observation evidence category is only in place for a third of the quality statements, whereas those feedback ones are in place pretty much universally. And I think what we're seeing is that services that do feedback well themselves, whether that's with a partnership like us, or whether that's themselves internally, have a stronger situation when CQC do turn up. Because if you just rely on who they bump into and who they call, you've got an open goal. In fact, we had a service recently who were told they hadn't worked with us, but we'd done some training for them. And they called me and said, so we had an assessment and they've told us point blank, the reason we didn't get an outstanding is because we didn't have enough feedback from people receiving care.
Yeah.
And it wasn't I told you so moment, because that's not what I'm like. But I did sit there and think, wow, this isn't just me theoretically saying the framework suggests this. This is CQC inspectors directly saying, we are not putting you forward for outstanding because of the lack of feedback. So we're really seeing a year on from when we were first talking about it, that feedback piece was not just me going off on one, it really has become central. And I think the third little thing I'd say, organising your evidence. I think what a lot of people forget is, yes, the regulations are the same. There are no changes in the Care Acts, the government regulations that underpin what you do. But the fact that CQC are collecting evidence in these ways with the quality statements, with the evidence categories, with the scoring, if we as services don't shift the way we organise our evidence to reflect that, then we're speaking two different languages. If CQC are coming at us with quality statements and evidence categories and 1 to 4 scores, and we're pinging them random emails and half a document here and something that someone said there, we're speaking two different languages. So we need to make sure that our evidence is organised using that structure. There are changes ahead with CQC, but the fundamentals of the evidence categories, the quality statements and the scoring have not changed. And if you aren't already, we need to make sure our evidence is structured as best possible in that way, so that we know where our strengths are, we know where our gaps are, and when we show things to CQC, we know we're both speaking the same language when we're going through that process.
Yeah, I mean, that I absolutely second your piece about feedback. I mean, we've noticed over the last 12 months the sort of the concentration of people really understanding how to get feedback, how to document it.
Yeah.
We created a CQC sort of facing event that is primarily for this.
Yeah.
And the excitement around that when we launched it last year was I mean, it was insane really. With how much people were like, I can see how that's going to massively help us. And I think there's definitely been a shift in this last 12, 18 months around how important people have realised feedback is, not just from, their residents, but from family, from employees. And I can definitely see why it is important, because it's that, it's the equivalent of reading testimonials online. And, everybody does that when they go to a hotel or whatever it is. And it is the equivalent of that with the care.
I mean, the wider concept I think that's really interesting is, when we think about care, we think of two things. We think of the NHS, because unfortunately we still seem to be the little sister. And then the other thing we think of is panorama investigations. And that is a big problem for our sector, is that the main thought process in the public's head when they think of care is, oh, those terrible ones on Panorama where people are having these horrible experiences, or, oh, it's the thing that's not the NHS but somehow exists. And I think what CQC have realised is, one of the things that CQC have come under attack on is whenever one of those Panorama things is kicked off, they always go, and they were rated CQC outstanding. And that's been something where CQC have realised, oh, goodness, we need to make sure that we are hearing as many voices to make sure we're not rating services that secretly have stuff kicking off. And I think in a broader contextual sense, this has also led to the focus on feedback. We can't just sit in the office with the manager and see all their wonderful spreadsheets and rotas. We need to make sure we're talking to people receiving care, their families and staff, so that we can have greater confidence when we stick that rating of good or outstanding, that we know that that is reflected in the people that are actively involved. So I think that's also been kind of the undercurrent to some of that shift.
Do you think then, if a provider's sort of fallen short of the standard, what their standards are, one of the first things they should look at is is feedback, or is there something that you think is more
Definitely.
important?
I think it's a two-pronged situation. Feedback has power for two reasons. Yes, it has a feedback evidence CQC. We'll go to that in a moment. But actually, at the end of the day, if things aren't going right for your service, we need to listen to the people who are experiencing that. And actually, I think obviously you've got those receiving care and their families is one, port of call. Also the staff. We've got to remember the staff really are the centre point for everything. They work day in, day out with the people receiving care. They're often the ones on the end of family members when they turn up and they've got a problem. And they're the ones working under your policies, your environment, your culture. So the staff almost become a lightning point for absolutely everything. So getting feedback from them, getting feedback from people receiving care, families, it doesn't just give you all this wonderful CQC evidence. It helps you know where the low-hanging fruit is. Because what we know now with this framework is if it's what people think, CQC are probably going to find out. So it's better that I find out today, make some changes so that when CQC do rock up, they can say, well, there was this issue 4 or 5 months ago, but since then, this and this and this has changed. And I think that's a really important point. We can use feedback, forget about CQC for a moment, to make sure our care quality is up to scratch, to get a look at those areas that perhaps people haven't told us need some looking at. And sometimes it's really, really little things. It's things like these particular rooms don't have access to the outside area space. You bring a local handy person in, they make a couple of ramps. You're like, oh my goodness, this totally changed the experience for those residents, for those family members, for the staff who aren't having to wheedle them through lots and lots of different rooms. So I think feedback is not just useful from CQC, it helps you know where your problems are. We were speaking, when I met CQC at one of the care events, I was talking to them through what we do and they were very happy with it. But one of the things they said to me, they said, it's quite an odd thing for a CQC leader to say, said, forget us for a moment. What you do is useful because it will genuinely improve care. Even if we never turned up, this feedback process ensures that care managers know what's going on, know where the improvements need to be made. So that has value aside from us turning up. And I think that's a really important part. It does two things. Yes, you've got the evidence. Yes, you've got CQC. But it's really about making sure that you are making changes based on what the actual needs are, not what you think the needs are in your head, in your office.
Well, that as well, that's a direct link to, the quality of someone's life. Their care home is their home.
Yeah.
So anything you can do that is going to serve them better, make their day-to-day better, make staff's day-to-day better, is that quality of life overall is just better. And then that culture piece and everything like that all follows that. So
Totally. I think it's something, sometimes I think about kind of when I visit residential services, which I've started to do a lot more this year, you sort of realise how tricky it must be to be in an environment where it is your home, but you have almost no say. So, and again, I know there's practicalities that will be dealt with. Things like, these are the times when you have breakfast. These are the times when you have lunch. I don't have breakfast. It's just one of my weird little quirks. So the idea of living somewhere where there are these external things that bind you is a challenge. And then bear in mind, we're not talking about people that are 4 or 5 or 6 years old where, it's kind of like you're a kid, handle it. We're talking about people, I remember sitting next to someone who was at a care home and chatting with him. He'd ran a massive real estate empire. The guy was like a tycoon. And now he has to have dinner between this time and this time. And I think what feedback does is just helps us clock into and remind ourselves that these individuals have really, really valid needs. And not everything can be acted on immediately. Not everything is necessarily actionable at all. But it just re-grounds us into going, we are serving people rather than running a service. And there are two very different things here. And I think feedback just helps us reclock and kind of reposition who it is we're supporting and putting them at the centre, which is such a buzz term, but actually putting them at the centre is sometimes really annoying. Like it's hard. It's hard to put 50 totally different people at the centre of their day. I've got 2 kids. Putting them at the centre of lunchtime is a blooming nightmare. So having 50 people who I have to put at the centre of their day in, day out, 24/7, is hard. So I'm not at all diminishing that. I think what the feedback processes do is it helps us recalibrate and go, okay, there are a few things here that we're missing that we maybe would have a really big impact if we can make those tweaks, make those changes.
Well, I always remember, and I can't remember whether it was on a podcast that the one that me and you did, or whether it was with whether it was a care provider. But somebody told me that basically one of the providers had an amazing lunch menu.
Oh, okay.
Their lunch menu was really diverse. They had loads of stuff on there. They were something they were really proud of.
Brilliant.
Actually, what it was doing was residents were getting overwhelmed by it. So rather than residents thinking, isn't this amazing? Look at all these choices we've got.
Choices for pudding.
It was actually making them overwhelmed, which then meant some residents then weren't going in for lunch, which then meant they weren't eating lunch, which then meant they were losing weight. And obviously that turns into a much bigger problem. And they did it through feedback of understanding what was going on. And all it took was them to go, right, actually what we need to do is, if we've got veggie options, we'll put those, there's 3, but they're on one menu. So vegetarians, there's your 3 choices or whatever it might be. We've got gluten-free options, they're on that menu. And then you've got your standard menu that's got 3 or 4 things on. So by splitting it out, rather than everything being on this huge big menu and them going in and literally not knowing what to do, by splitting it out, that then solved the problem. Yeah. But I think that's such a good, it always sticks with me, that example, because I think it's such a good example of something that somebody in the care, in the organisation has thought, what an amazing thing, which you can definitely see why it would be.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But actually, when they dug down into it, it was actually starting to cause issues. So
I think it's one of those things where sometimes things become counterintuitive. You think, it's really good. We're giving people discipline because they can have their meals at each time. Yeah. And then you sit there and think, oh, wait a second, maybe as adults, we don't always eat at the same time. And so on and so on. So I think all these things, sometimes the most logical option is not actually the option that fits life. And that's where feedback can really be helpful to kind of put a pin in some of our logic that we think is, of course, this thing. And then 11 people say, no, this thing. You go, oh, okay. Well, who am I here for? Am I here to make this rota as pain-free as possible? Or am I here to support these people? And obviously there's a bit of a balance, but where possible, we need to put those individual needs at the centre. Definitely.
I'm going to move on because me and you could talk about feedback, I think, for hours.
This is our first 7-hour podcast, everyone.
We know technology is a big enabler. You know, we work in technology world. We know about that. So how can care providers leverage the tech to meet their expectations and CQ standards, but also exceed them? And how can they what can they pick that really helps them to do that?
I think CQC have almost by accident turbocharged the tech adoption. So not necessarily on purpose. I mean, maybe they have, and it's kind of like an evil genius plan they had. But because they are doing these remote inspections, just to make it clear, they are still turning up in person, but a lot of services are sending evidence documents sometimes 4, 5, 6 weeks after the inspection. This is a good thing because it means that the inspector is not spending the whole day flipping through folders and you're having to have a panic attack while you try and log into so-and-so's domain because that's who's got all the documents. It's made things a lot easier. And actually, a lot of services have said, in some ways, CQC inspections are a bit less stressful because the inspector isn't having to do everything. I mean, imagine trying to assess a whole service in a day or 2. So the inspectors are slightly calmer because they haven't got the whole weight of everything. But what this has meant is that the way you bring those documents to CQC now is digital. So the days of the big old ring bind folder, it literally, unless you have someone scanning everything, it's not going to work. So CQC, almost by accident, by having these remote inspectors that assess the documents, they have made everyone move to digital. So I think for an absolute fundamental, unless you have a really great team of scanners, you cannot send evidence to CQC without it being on a screen because the inspector is not there to flick through your folder. You need to get it onto the remote inspector screen. So that's the first thing they've kind of forced, is the kind of the need for everything to be digitally available. But I think the other thing that we're seeing is that as a result of this kind of move towards digital, it's helping services to think through, okay, how can I group and label this evidence? How can I organise it? And what a lot of services, they're using things like OneDrive and Teams with other things, because they're sitting there going, okay, we've got all of these documents and all these different platforms. We need to centralise it so that we can then share that information. So I think tech is really helping people to think through, okay, what have we got? Where is it? How can we organise it? And I think also as well, people are realising that using this tech well is a greater evidence than just them saying, we think we do this well. So I think a lot of the monitoring tools within a lot of these tech products is enabling services to have more confidence and put kind of a stronger foot forward around where they are at in some of these different areas. So I think it's enforcing that need to have things available digitally. It's about the organisation, the labelling, and it's about having that higher confidence that what we are doing really is meeting the standards. I think something that tech platforms need to be really savvy on, and I think maybe a few years ago they were less so, because tech platforms were like, we've got you forever. So we won't let you export your data because then you'll always have to use us. I think what tech platforms have recognised, particularly with the framework and with the way care is going, it's not so much about interoperability yet, because that's a whole minefield for now, but at least being able to get stuff out of your system is vital. Because at the end of the day, if you have got a remote inspector, you don't want to send them 14 different logins.
Yeah.
You want to be able to go, here's what we've pulled off of this platform, here's what we've pulled off of that platform, here's that piece of evidence, here's that piece of evidence. So I think making sure that your tech platforms can export their data in ways that are universal. So not kind of a weird, funky file type, but an Excel or a PDF or a Word or a PowerPoint. I think that's something that a lot of tech platforms have got their head around and gone, okay, we can't just be insular and keep ourselves, you have to log in to see it. We have to be able to export this, because CQC are not coming in and standing over your shoulder and using the computer anymore. They are sitting, in Northampton somewhere behind an email waiting for you to email that through to us.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big shift. Tech platforms are realising the need to be able to release information in kind of standard, typical Microsoft platforms.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to what you mentioned earlier about thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. So as a tech platform, it's about going, well, actually, we want that care group or support service to run to the best of their ability, to have the best rating that they can possibly get, to be, given the best quality of care. So actually, by our system talking to a care planning software or to, EPR software or whatever it might be, by linking all of that together, that helps people get the bigger picture. It helps have that overall report rather than it being, well, this is this one, this is that one, that bit's over there. And I think it is about kind of then going back to why are we doing what we're doing? Yeah.
And for care services, if if you think of it like CQC sometimes feels like an exam, and certainly the old framework, it felt like an exam. They turn up, you've got this 2 days to perform. Now, I often describe it as kind of like very small percentage exam, majority coursework, because that's what you're doing. You're sending all these documents off at a later point, a little bit like coursework. Done my exam, here's my supporting coursework. If you as a platform aren't giving people the coursework for them to submit, they're not going to have a great feel about you, because in their hour of need, you literally made their life harder. And I think that's where tech platforms are, whether it's interoperability, whether it's at least being able to export and share easily and in universal software terms, share that evidence. Doing that ensures that your care service doesn't feel let down by you in their greatest hour of need. So I think it's really incumbent on tech platforms to realise they will judge you most when they are under their most pressure, which is why your platforms need to meet those specific needs, or else they'll sit there and go, do you remember when we had that inspection and we couldn't send them all of that stuff because there was a whole bunch of things that platform didn't do. So I think it's a really important part of supporting services is being there in that kind of time of need.
Yeah. And I think there's a bit that goes back as well to what you mentioned at the very beginning about talking the right language, about, that shared language of, you've just said about care providers or support services using, Teams folders, shared statements, but naming them as to make it easy. And I think that's the same with like tech platforms. It's if you're creating something specifically around CQC, how do you make it easy for that organisation or that user to then attribute that to that particular category or whatever you want to name it as? But I think it is about that flexibility of being able to change as these things have changed as well, and making it easy for the user to be able to categorise.
Exactly, using that same language rather than seeing us as something that's adjacent to CQC. Let's use the rule book, let's use the definitions to structure and label what we're doing.
Definitely. I know you mentioned earlier about preparing staff for inspections, and you touched on, that being one of the key things about actually, almost not training necessarily, but, making sure staff are comfortable talking to CQC inspectors. So are there any other practical steps that leaders can take to empower their teams under the new framework? And especially when you think about, avoiding change fatigue, maximising engagement, all those kind of things that are really important when it comes to this.
So I think with care staff and support staff, people that work in services, we need to give them space to practice speaking, because it's very easy to say, right, a question you might get asked is, how does the service assess needs? Yeah, it's very easy to say to someone, that's the question, so have a little think. But actually, anyone will know, if you're under pressure, the bit of your brain that's thinking and the bit of your brain that's talking are separate. And you can get to a point where what's in your head and what comes out of your mouth is incredibly different. And what we need to do is we need to help staff not have that experience by almost giving them space to answer those questions. And the hardest thing, I remember years ago, I did radio presenting, and I remember someone listened to a show I'd done and said, the problem with you, Louie, is you don't stop talking because you don't want people to feel uncomfortable, which is true. He said, but the best answers are when you let people feel uncomfortable in the pause. Just about having a care staff member and going, okay, tell us about how we as a service assess needs and how we ensure that people's care plans are up to date. And then rather than going, so you could talk about this, or you could talk, just being silent and almost having that uncomfortable 3 seconds that will feel like 4 hours where they're going, you need to support people to go through that, or else that will happen during the conversation with CQC. And it's not so much that that's going to be a problem for you, it's that staff member, it goes back to that same thing about the tech. Was I supported in the most tricky part of my journey so far? Did I feel supported and able to have those conversations? So I think we need to create space for people to actually have those practice conversations. We did, as a result of kind of being asked by a lot of the services we provided training for, we have created a thing called Care Staff Confidence, which is kind of like a video program that has lots of practice questions and practice tasks. Because what services were saying to us was, we need some help so that we know what sort of questions CQC might ask, and to have some resources so that we can support staff to actually go through these practice interviews, go through answering their questions like, what do I do if I don't understand the question? What do I do if I need to give negative feedback, but I don't want to completely tank the service? And also really simple things like teach staff to use the words good and outstanding. Instead of saying things are wonderful, lovely, fabulous, great, use the words good or outstanding. Because if CQC are doing professional judgment now, kind of sitting in their own heads when they assess this kind of feedback, we want to give them the language such that they can make those assessments quicker. 10 people say something is outstanding, that has a really strong impact. If 10 people say it's lovely, fabulous, great, wonderful, nice, really good here, that can go into a range of different assessments. We need to help staff to speak that language and have that experience so they're reasonably confident. It's not about giving perfect textbook answers. It's about people feeling like what was in their head came out of their mouth, and that they were supported during that, let's be blunt, quite scary or quite unique, if not scary, unique. It's, if you've been working in care for 6 months, it is weird for a random 50-something-year-old CQC inspector to be asking you about, how you manage meds. That is a weird experience for a lot of people. It's not typical of them in that role. So we need to make sure we're supporting them so they feel ready to have those conversations.
I think as well, it's reminding them, isn't it? It's not a test. And yes. I think, you mentioned there about giving them the confidence to answer when they do need to give a negative.
Yes.
Something that might feel negative.
Yeah.
And for them not to walk away and think, oh my gosh, what have I just said?
Yeah.
That's the last thing you want somebody to feel, because you don't want to think, what have I done?
Yeah.
But I think having that, it's not a test. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
But I think
time to celebrate is a big one as well.
Definitely. And I think, that tip about using the terminology of outstanding and good, and I think is a brilliant tip, because you're right, that inspector's going to hear that same word as opposed to hearing the thing that means the same thing.
Yeah, but isn't in the language.
Yeah.
A big one I often say to services when they're trying to work out how do we get our staff ready for this, I say, look, one of the problems services have had is that for the last 10 years, CQC are the big bad wolf. And I, as the service manager, I am protecting you from these scary CQC people. And so we've kind of positioned the CQC as the bad guys and the manager is the hero because we're protecting. Now that whole model's been chucked in the bin and they are in this mess with you. So what we need to do is we need to re-articulate what CQC are, that they are there to make sure that we're providing great care. It's an opportunity to celebrate. The biggest thing that I've been saying to services is when you introduce this, don't say CQC are going to want to speak with you, CQC are going to want to interview you, CQC are going to judge our services based on what you're saying. That's not the headline. The way we frame it is CQC want to hear from you. They value what you have to say. In the past, they didn't. They hung out with me in the office all day and they were looking at spreadsheets. Now they've realized how valuable you are, and they basically CQC are giving you opportunities to be heard. And that turns it from being you're being judged, you're being assessed, this is a scary conversation, to this is a chance for you to be listened to. And I think if we frame it as CQC are giving you a chance to be listened to, it shows respect to staff rather than fear. And it also communicates to staff that this is not kind of a tick box exercise. They genuinely want to get a better idea of what is the service like from your perspective.
I love that switch. I think that's something that I think everyone can think about how they do it. So we have a couple of similar things that are similar, like that I always think about when talking about that is you can report an incident or you can record an incident.
Yeah.
It means exactly the same thing, but actually report sounds blame, negative.
Yeah.
This awful thing happened. Recording it is, it needs to, it's compliance, it needs to go in there. We'll learn from it, we'll understand what happened, and we'll move on and put into place what we need to.
Yeah.
And there's another one as well that I think one of our customers uses, and instead of it being called a near miss, they call it a good catch.
Oh, I like that.
Which again, it actually means fundamentally the same thing. Something could have happened, but it didn't. You caught it. But the two sound so different from a perception.
A big one I heard recently was the difference between a supervision and a catch-up. Because supervision sounds like I'm being supervised.
Yeah, you're in trouble.
Because things have gone wrong. Yeah. Whereas saying things are a catch-up, again, supervisions, you still do the same supervision-y aspects, perhaps in part, but it changes the focus. Instead of it being about, I am supervising you, it's I'm catching up with you to check that you're okay, check that things are going okay. Yes, check that processes and things are being done as needed, but the focus is not on you being supervised, it's on you being heard. And again, with these CQC conversations, it's not about CQC are going to interview your staff. It's actually about CQC are going to listen to your staff. And that is a better way of framing this so that our care staff feel that, okay, this is manageable. This is not a reason to quit and go and work at Aldi. No disrespect to all the wonderful people at Aldi, but it's a genuine concern. We need to make sure that this experience of working in the care sector is a positive one. We don't want something like this, which actually, in the grand scheme of things, is quite small. It might happen for one day every 2, 3, 4 years. We need to make sure that this doesn't cause undue additional stress and anxiety.
I was just going to say that's exactly what it can cause for some people who are terrified about, something like this. It's stress that's not needed.
Yeah.
It is kind of that, someone could be sat at home all night thinking, gosh, they want to talk to me tomorrow. Oh, it's an interview. I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm really worried about it. Prevent them from sleeping that night.
Yeah,
then they come in and they're more like, it's just. Whereas actually, I think you're so right. They want to hear from you. They want your opinion.
Yeah.
They want to listen.
Yeah.
It's such a different way of viewing it. And I think that other point that you mentioned about people feeling like they can have a couple of seconds to think about what to say. Obviously doing a podcast, it is the most unnatural thing when you're just sat listening to people, because you automatically want to go, of course. And it was something that somebody taught us about at the very, very beginning, not to constantly fill the silences, and don't worry about it if there is a few seconds. But sometimes that few seconds, especially in the early days, felt like a long time.
Yeah.
It's just, I think it's allowing people that breathing space, isn't it? To
Totally.
think about it. It's not a test. Don't worry about it. They just want to listen to your opinion, and you kind of go with that bit. And I think that people will go in with a much clearer head and a much calmer, kind of perception of everything around it, which then helps
the whole process goes smoother.
Yeah.
I think another thing, just a little point for care services themselves, manage your contact details carefully. Now, what I mean by this is, let's say you've got 100 staff members. If you send them the contact details of 12, they're going to get annoyed. If you send them 98 out of 100, probably not going to be too much of a problem. But a better way of doing it is to have the contextual information. So you might send them the full 100, but you might want to add things like, this individual has English as an additional language. A really key one that we always say you include is when they started, because there's nothing wrong. CQC might definitely want to speak to someone that's only been there 3 weeks, because that's going to be a pretty good chance to pick up the vibe. But if you've got 8 staff that have all joined in the last 3 weeks, and those are the only people CQC speak to, and they don't know that, then it's going to look pretty haphazard. So if they can say, okay, that's a staff member we can contact that's been here for 4 or 5 years, that's a staff member that's been here a week or 2. So I think if we can provide that additional information, we would hope that CQC would take some note of that and be selective in who they speak to and call. If you don't provide that information, you are assuming that CQC will clock these differences. And quite simply, they're busy enough such that they won't. So make sure that any details you share, you don't just put the name of the number, add contextual information. Could be additional language, could be to do the amount of time they've worked there, could be that they're in the midst of a disciplinary. That doesn't mean that they're not worth speaking to. They might actually want to explore that process. But if they don't know that and they speak to that person and that person absolutely goes off on one and they're not aware that there's also something going on, it's not that the disciplinary excuses or falsifies that person's claims. It's just that we want someone to have an idea of who they're speaking to. It's a little bit like, imagine getting all of your friends together in a party and then you don't turn up to the party and someone else comes and they don't know anything about any of these people and your relationship with them. That could go very wrong depending on who's in the room. And the same with CQC. We want to make sure that they know who's in the room so that when they have those conversations, they approach them with the professional knowledge they need to understand, to discern, to manage that conversation in a way that means that those individuals are giving the best, and by best I mean truest, not most positive, truest account. And I think that additional contextual information makes CQC's job a bit easier, but more importantly, avoids the possibility of them speaking to people that are saying all kinds of things with no understanding of the context behind it.
I think that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that providers could definitely take away from listening to this.
It's a really easy one that can save a lot of heartache down the road.
Oh, brilliant. I'm going to touch a little bit on care research because obviously, we know care research plays a pivotal role in supporting care providers.
Thank you.
Obviously, things have changed a lot since we spoke 18 months ago.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit more about the work you do and that you're doing at the moment and how it's helping with CQC compliance and the work that you're doing with care providers as well?
The main thing that we do at Care Research is exactly that. We do research within care. Particularly, we do feedback surveys for care services, learning disability services. So those areas of, residents and family surveys, staff surveys, partner surveys, we run that whole process. So we can create the questions, send out the surveys, get all the responses through and make really lovely evidence documents. What we've found, so when we first started 6 years ago, we were kind of in the marketing space. We were making pretty pamphlets and pretty booklets. When CQC pivoted to feedback, we realised that actually what we're doing now is fundamentally a compliance issue. 61% of the evidence CQC are going to collect is in those 3 feedback categories. So we changed a huge amount of what we did to ensure that our evidence documents and our processes meant that they fit the framework. So every question is its own evidence document. Every question has a quality statement. Every question is pinned to the evidence categories and the scoring. But I think what's most important about what we're doing is we're enabling services to have that clear, CQC-ready, independent feedback. What I think's been interesting over this last year is that a lot of clients have come to us and said, hey, we love what you're doing. Can we do it ourselves? Because actually we've got a quality team or we've got some people within our services that have got some things they want to do research on. And so one of the things that we are now launching is care surveys. Care surveys is basically us in your pocket. So it is all the care research tools, the document creation, the survey creation for services. So it means that services can have a much greater oversight of the data and the stuff that comes through, but also for those that want to just use the platform themselves, they can make their own surveys, they can run their own survey process, they can do their own feedback. And I think what's really great about that for services is it means that they have complete control, it means that they have complete oversight, it means they can do whatever surveys they want in whatever way. You've got all the questions, all the CQC questions that we use in the question banks. You can make your own stuff too. And I think another really cool thing we've been doing over this year is our accessible surveys. So this is about having video surveys, PECS video surveys, Makaton video surveys, video record questions. So for people that perhaps can't write or type, they can record a video about their experiences. And again, all of that is in the Care Surveys platform. So it enables you to create surveys that really do work for everyone, or as close to everyone in your service as we can get to. I think for a lot of services, it's about making sure, how do we do this feedback piece well? How do we do it consistently, especially if you've got a large organization with 40, 50, 60, 70 homes? You don't want different home managers sending out different surveys, different questions. It's all a big mess. This is about making sure that you have a really clear, concerted, designated, organized way of doing feedback that is built for care. You can use a SurveyMonkey, you can use Google Forms, you can use Typeform. Love all of those. They're great. We've nicked all their ideas and built it into our platform.
Just create it yourself.
Because at the end of the day, capturing the survey response is easy. Anyone can send a link out. It's turning that into evidence that CQC will understand. And so what we've got with the Care Surveys platform is you can do your surveys, you can make them on our platform, and then all of those questions are automatically pinned to the quality statements. The evidence documents make sense. They make sense to CQC. They've got the 1 to 4 rating. They've got the quality statement evidence. They've got the key question terms that are needed. And what we've found this year, about 14, 15 months ago, I was saying, it's going to be really useful. CQC, I think, are going to like it. We can now categorically say CQC do like it. A lot of our services have been inspected. The things that CQC have pointed out is that they love that the documents make sense. They're in the quality statements. They've got 1 to 4 scores. So we can say, okay, this quality statement, kindness, compassion, and dignity, you've got 30 responses. And overall, your residents and families scored you a 3.2. They scored you a good. That's really helpful in comparison to, here's 15 emails and a couple of scribbles in the scrapbook for you to use to kind of come up with an idea of where they're at. We are giving the inspectors the scores for each of these quality statements for the residents, the families, the staff, and the professional partners. And it's enabling CQC to make those feedback assessments more fairly, rather than just kind of sitting in the head and going, okay, had a look at a couple of emails, a couple of little notes, a couple of compliment boxes. What does that mean? You want to get out of the CQC inspector's head as much as possible, because that's where we move into bias. That's where we move into confirmation bias. That's where we move into, how did you think that when we showed you this? What we've got with our platform, with our surveys, is you know that it's in the language of the CQC. You are showing CQC, our residents rated us outstanding. Our staff rated us good or outstanding in this area. Our partners rated us good for this quality statement in this area. And that means that the process of turning all that feedback into a rating becomes smoother and more accurate.
I think as well, think about the time and that time that is involved in, especially if you've got multiple homes, you want them all to be sending the same stuff out. Of course you do. So I think the timing of kind of knowing that everything's going out, the time saved that you're not having to then analyze all that information, work out which category it goes in, all that sort of stuff. I think people do underestimate how long this stuff takes, and especially because you need to do it consistently. You can't just do it once and then forget about it for a few years. It needs to be consistent. So I think by doing it that way, it helps have that consistent approach as well.
CQC are very open. They've said, look, any feedback that's over a year, we're not really interested in. So if you did the best survey ever in kind of January 2023, it doesn't exist anymore. You haven't got it to lean on. So I think, we've got our Care Research Premium process, which is where we run the surveys. And that's great, particularly for a really small service and you haven't got a lot of personnel and you just want someone to make this problem go away. We can run the whole thing. All you have to do is send off and print out some QR codes and send the survey links. We run everything. So that's great for those smaller services who are kind of sitting there going, I'm already at 150% capacity. Don't give me surveys for the whole blooming lot too. So that's great for those small services. For the larger groups who perhaps have big quality teams, what the Care Surveys platform does is it means that you can do that yourself much quicker, much better. You don't have to do a lot of thinking. You don't have to do a lot of fiddling. All of the analysis is built into the system. All of the evidence documents are built into the system. So really, again, all you really have to do is create those surveys and share them using the questions that we have in our question bank, or making your own and picking which quality statements, and then clicking a few buttons to then create those beautiful output documents. So again, whether we're running it all for you or whether you're using the platform yourself, it's saving you time. Because at the end of the day, something I've been saying to services a lot, you don't really care about Excel spreadsheets. You don't really care about things like Boolean scores, which is, giving people 2 options or 4 options. This is not your world. It is our world because we're weird and boring people. We are building this into your world quickly and easily so that you can focus on the bit you do care about, which is making change. You don't want to fiddle about for hours making a survey. You want to get it done, get it out, and then a few weeks later, have all the comments organized and categorized so that you can sit there and go, what do we do next? That's why you're doing these surveys. You're not doing surveys because you like doing surveys. You're doing these feedback processes so that you can improve care. And whether it's us doing it all for you, whether it's the Care Surveys platform, it gets you to that what do we do next point quicker.
Yeah.
Rather than you tearing your hair out, screaming at the computer because Google Forms is doing something weird. If you know what
I've been there.
Yeah. Haven't we all? Yeah.
So finally, I'd like to end on kind of what's your top piece of advice for providers who want to stay ahead of, regulation changes, what might be coming up. I guess what are the top 3 actions every care provider should prioritise today? Okay,
so I think in terms of keeping on top of things, do connect with us on LinkedIn. Predominantly Louie Werth, myself, we do a lot of updates, we do a lot of free webinars, because at the end of the day, what we've found about CQC is they often like to publish their changes at 4 p.m. on a Friday, which is not when everyone is like, oh, yes. CQC have ruined my weekend at least 15 times over the last year. And my wife always knows because usually it's about bath time. And I go, Jeanette, I need you to look after the kids in the bath because CQC have sent something and I need to process it so I can write about it on Monday.
She must love CQC.
Oh, shit, yeah. I don't think she's the biggest fan. Yeah. But what it means is that, keep in touch with us, follow us. We do try and keep those regular updates. We've got webinars reasonably frequently. They're all free so that people can understand some of the changes that are coming down the line. In terms of what you do to prepare, have confidence. The quality statements, the evidence categories, the 1 to 4 scoring are in place. Yes, CQC are tweaking around the edges and they're doing some work around what happens when they physically visit and write the reports. But those structures are in place. So make sure, if you aren't already, make sure you're using them with your evidence organisation and labelling. And I think the third thing that we really need to work on, feedback and staff prep. At the end of the day, we need to ensure that staff can confidently give an account. It's not about being word perfect, but it's about them feeling that what they say is a fair reflection and making sure that those feedback processes, whether it's something that you do in partnership with us, whether it's something you do internally, you make sure those feedback processes are going well. Because at the end of the day, if you have the best processes and the best observation in the world, you could still get inadequate if all of those feedbacks are not in place. And as we've said earlier, we do know of at least 1 or 2 services who have been openly told the reason you didn't get an outstanding is because you didn't have the level of feedback we required. So doing that feedback piece well is central to gaining or maintaining that good and outstanding rating.
Amazing. Well, Louie, thank you so much for coming back. It's been amazing as always.
Oh,
you always
you.
leave. I think you always give. I just think there's always little things that people can take away. And, our aim with this podcast is always just for somebody to listen to it. If they take one little piece of advice away that they feel they can implement, I think it's always a massive help. And when it comes to CQC, anything around that is super helpful. So thank you so much for coming back.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll invite you again in 18 months and see what's happening then.
the triumphant third ever podcast. Yeah.
And I don't know, we asked you this question obviously the last time you came, so I'm hoping you've got another one. So you will know that we end every episode on our What the HealthTech moment. And we like to try and find a standout moment, something that's had impact, weird, wonderful, emotional, whatever that might be. So can you share with us what your What the HealthTech moment is for this episode?
I'm going to cheat. As this is my second time, I'm going to give 2 mini ones.
That's
fine by me. The first one is, we've been building this platform, Care Surveys. I am not a tech person. Well, I am. I can open an email and I can send text and WhatsApp and normal stuff, but I don't know coding. I don't know Python and Java and JSON, and I don't know any of this. And what I've found out is that having a tech platform built by someone that doesn't know anything about tech is brilliant, because at the end of the day, I know how to make these documents. I know what this platform needs to look like. And what that has meant is that it really has focused on the user experience, whereas sometimes UX, user experience, comes in second. So you build the thing, and then the UX goes, okay, this needs to move there. We've had it right from the beginning, because I've been sitting there going, why does it do that? So that's been a really interesting moment, building a tech platform with no understanding of any kind of code. So not the most exhilarating or kind of emotional one. My second What the HealthTech, last time I talked about my great-grandmother and my mum almost setting the house on fire, and she used that little red button. So this one is about my grandmother. So it's my great-grandmother's daughter, so my nana. So my nana had kind of end-of-life care at her home. And she was kind of, she was in the last few months. And it was a really simple moment where essentially the care support staff member said, you're down here as Lisa. How would you like us to refer? And we'd always known her as Lisa my whole life. That was her name. And she turned around and said, Elizabeth. And we were all sitting there going, sorry, what? And then my nan told us that my late grandfather, who turns out probably wasn't the most fabulous of people, had basically said to her when they got married, Elizabeth's too long, so your name's Lisa now. So she had spent her whole adult life called Lisa because of her then husband's essentially decree that he couldn't be bothered to say Elizabeth. And then literally in that last 2 months, she went exclusively by the name Elizabeth.
Wow.
And we had our first daughter during that time, so we gave her the middle name Elizabeth to kind of stamp that out. Yeah. But I thought it was just such a fascinating moment when you realise that in that last moment, just that simple question of what would you like to be called led to someone almost going, you know what, I've got nothing to lose now. Call me Elizabeth. And I thought it was a surreal moment for us because I was sitting there going, no, that's not your name. And then realising, no, it is her name. Yeah. And it was her name. And in that moment, she had the confidence to go, actually, I make the rules on this. These are my last few months. I'm making the rules. My name isn't Lisa anymore. It's Elizabeth.
I love that for 2 reasons. So I love it. I love that she had the confidence to go and she thought, no, I would actually like to be called by my name for the remainder of my life.
Yeah.
But also I love that such a simple thing that the carer had asked actually was something really important that carer, whilst they've asked it, have not thought anything of it.
No. It's part of the process.
I just think that's an amazing kind of thing that probably meant a lot to your nan.
Huge. And to us as well. Yeah. We all sat there and thought, oh, literally, we're going to call my daughter's middle name was going to be Lisa. And then they said that. I was like, oh, looks like it's Elizabeth then. Yes.
Which again is a lovely thing that then happened on the back of it, isn't it?
Exactly.
Oh, see, this is why I love What the HealthTech Moments, because you just don't know what's going to happen. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you for having me.
And like I said, we will look at getting you back on again for a third one at some point. So thank you very much for everyone for listening. If you've got any questions for Louie, feel free to send them through to us and we'll pass those on. We'll also put the links to care research and things like that, obviously, on the podcast, on the link, so everyone can follow that. Join us next time for another new episode. Don't forget to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're interested in being a guest or have any questions, then don't forget to email whatthehealthtech@radarhealthcare.com.